When Big Shaq Mercer steps in to help a struggling mother and her crying baby at a cafe, he never expects it to go viral, for all the wrong reasons. Twisted headlines turn him into a villain, and soon, the world is choosing sides. But as the truth unravels, hidden pasts resurface, unexpected alliances form, and one woman is forced to confront everything she was raised to believe. In a society where perception is power, will redemption come too late? Or can a single moment change everything? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Big Shaq sat in the corner booth of Perkins Café, a small but busy coffee shop tucked between an old bookstore and a laundromat. It was the kind of place where the regulars knew each other, where the barista already had your order ready before you spoke. Shaq liked it here. It was quiet, simple, far removed from the world he used to be part of. He sipped his black coffee, scanning the morning crowd. A mix of office workers, students buried in their laptops, and parents grabbing a quick caffeine fix before the day took over. Then came the crying. At the center of the cafe, a young mother, Victoria, struggled with a wailing baby in a stroller. The child's screams cut through the usual hum of conversation, drawing irritated glances from customers. Some sighed audibly, others exchanged looks of annoyance. Victoria, clearly exhausted, bounced the baby on her knee, her movements frantic and desperate. Shaq watched for a moment, recognizing the panic in her eyes, the kind of exhaustion that came from long nights and no help. He had seen it before, and he had never been the kind to ignore someone in trouble. He stood, walking toward her slowly, keeping his posture non-threatening. "Excuse me, miss. Need a hand?" His voice was deep but gentle, offering help, not intrusion. Victoria's head snapped up. Her blue eyes locked onto his, but instead of relief, they hardened with suspicion. "I don't need your help," she snapped, pulling the baby closer. The words carried more than just frustration. They carried something uglier. A few customers looked up, sensing the sudden shift in the air. The barista behind the counter hesitated mid-pour. The tension thickened, invisible but undeniable. Shaq stayed calm. He had dealt with people like this before, people who saw his skin before they saw him. He had learned to pick his battles, but this wasn't about him. It was about a struggling mother and a baby who just needed comfort. "I get it," he said, keeping his voice even. "Just thought I'd offer. Sometimes a fresh face can help calm a baby down." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I said no." She wasn't just refusing. She was making a point. The cafe felt heavier now. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. A woman near the window muttered something under her breath, while an older man in a suit gave Shaq a disapproving glance, as if he had overstepped. Shaq exhaled slowly. He could walk away, let it go. But the baby was still crying. He crouched slightly, keeping his tone light. "Little one just needs some soothing, that's all." Victoria bristled. "You don't know anything about my child." The irritation in her voice had turned to anger. Not just at him, but at everything. The stares, the judgment, the exhaustion. But Shaq wasn't the enemy here. "You're right," he said simply. "I don't. But I do know stress, and right now, you both have plenty of it." A few people nodded subtly, seeming to agree. A woman in a business suit whispered to her friend, glancing at Victoria with a mix of sympathy and unease. That only made Victoria more defensive. She stood abruptly, jostling the baby, her hands gripping the stroller too tightly. "Just leave us alone," she hissed. Shaq held up his hands in surrender. "All right, no problem." He stepped back, giving her space. The moment stretched uncomfortably, like a drawn-out silence in a bad movie. Then, the baby let out the loudest cry yet. A man near the counter groaned. "Oh, for God's sake, take him outside." Victoria's face flushed red. From embarrassment or fury, it was hard to tell. She grabbed the stroller and began fumbling with the straps, her movements rushed and clumsy. The crying didn't stop. Shaq didn't move. He knew what was coming next. The breaking point. He had seen it before in boardrooms, in back alleys, in his own reflection. That moment when frustration boiled over, when emotions clouded judgment. Victoria hit hers in the worst way possible. She turned sharply, her voice ringing through the cafe. "I don't need your charity, and I sure as hell don't need help from someone like you." The room froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. A few people gasped. The woman in the business suit widened her eyes. The barista, who had been steaming milk, let the sound linger for a second too long. The hiss unnaturally loud in the silence. Shaq? Shaq just stared at her. His face remained unreadable, his expression carefully neutral. He had heard worse before. He had learned not to react, not in moments like this, not when it was exactly what people wanted. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. Victoria, realizing what she had just said, clamped her mouth shut. She looked around, seeing the way people were watching her now. Not just Shaq, but her. The baby hiccuped between sobs, tiny hands clenched into fists. Shaq exhaled, long and slow. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his booth. The tension didn't break. If anything, it got worse. People looked away, pretending they hadn't heard what had just happened, pretending they weren't part of the moment. Victoria sat down, her movements stiff, her face unreadable now. But her fingers trembled slightly as she rocked the stroller, trying to soothe the baby. From across the room, a waitress, Riley, carefully approached Shaq. She set a fresh coffee on his table, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the house. And I'm sorry." Shaq gave a small nod, but said nothing. He didn't need an apology, because he had a feeling this wasn't over yet. The hum of the cafe had returned, but something about it felt different. People went back to their conversations, their coffees, their phones, yet an unspoken tension still lingered in the air. Shaq knew this feeling. It was the kind of silence that followed an uncomfortable moment people wished they could forget. At his table, the coffee in front of him had gone lukewarm, but he wasn't really paying attention to it. His mind replayed the scene from earlier. Victoria's sharp voice, the looks from the customers, the weight of something unspoken beneath her words. Then, a soft clink. A fresh cup of coffee landed in front of him. Riley, the waitress, stood there, her expression careful. She was in her mid-20s, with auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a weariness in her eyes that suggested she had seen too much of the world already. She had been working at Perkins' Cafe for as long as Shaq had been coming here, and though they had never spoken much, she always seemed to notice more than she let on. "On the house," she said quietly, glancing toward Victoria's table. "And I'm sorry about that." Shaq didn't react right away. He took the cup, turning it slowly in his hands. "You don't have to apologize." Riley hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I know, but Victoria's got a lot going on." Shaq finally looked up. Her voice carried something, hesitation, maybe even guilt. "What kind of a lot?" he asked. Riley sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "She's not..." She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "She's not just some angry lady looking for a fight. It's more complicated than that." Shaq studied her. He could tell she wasn't just saying this out of sympathy for Victoria. She was saying it because she believed it. Before he could respond, a sharp, exhausted sigh cut through the room. Victoria. She was still at her table trying, failing, to soothe her crying baby. Victoria's hands shook as she adjusted the baby's blanket, her fingers gripping the fabric too tightly. The crying hadn't stopped, and the stress was eating away at her. Shaq could see it now. This wasn't just a bad day. This was something deeper. Her eyes flickered around the cafe, catching every stare, every judgmental glance. She knew what people were thinking, that she was a bad mother, that she couldn't even handle her own child. And that realization only made her frustration worse. She leaned forward, whispering something to the baby, but her voice was tight, strained. The baby squirmed in her arms, wailing louder. Across the cafe, a businessman in a navy suit muttered something under his breath and shook his head. A young woman with earbuds in dramatically rolled her eyes. The judgment was thick enough to choke on. Shaq knew this feeling too. Being watched. being silently measured and dismissed. Victoria wasn't just fighting to calm her baby. She was fighting the weight of every stare, every assumption. But instead of accepting help, she clung to her pride like a lifeline. Shaq exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He had been here long enough to recognize when people needed help, but were too stubborn to take it. Pride could be heavier than any burden. He was about to go back to his coffee when something caught his attention. A man sitting alone near the window. Mid-40s, slicked back dark hair, sharp features, a well-pressed gray suit that looked out of place in a small cafe like this. He wasn't reading the newspaper in front of him. He was watching Shaq. More specifically, he was taking notes. Shaq's instincts kicked in immediately. Who the hell is this guy? The man's eyes flicked up from his phone for a split second, just long enough for Shaq to catch him. Then, just as smoothly, he looked back down, pretending to scroll. Shaq didn't like it. Didn't like being watched. Didn't like being a subject of interest. His past had taught him to recognize when someone was paying a little too much attention. This wasn't just curiosity. This was intentional. Shaq wasn't sure if it was related to the scene with Victoria, or if it was something else entirely. But he had a feeling this wasn't the last time he'd see the man in the suit. Victoria let out a shaky breath, rubbing her temples. The baby was still crying, but now she wasn't even trying to soothe him. She looked done, not just tired, defeated. Shaq's jaw tightened. He knew that look too. It was the look of someone carrying more than they could handle. A waitress, one of the younger girls, hesitated before stepping forward. Miss, would you like me to warm up some milk or—" "No," Victoria snapped. Her voice cracked slightly, as if she wasn't just yelling at the waitress, but at the entire world. The room fell silent again. Victoria buried her face in her hands. The baby kept crying. Shaq let out a slow breath. He had a choice to make. He could let it go, walk out, pretend it wasn't his problem. Or he could do something, even if she didn't want him to. Because sometimes, help isn't about what people want. It's about what they need. The weight of the moment pressed heavy against the walls of Perkins' cafe. The tension from Victoria's outburst still hung in the air, her exhaustion evident in the way she clutched at the stroller, fingers trembling as the baby's wails grew louder. Shaq exhaled slowly, pushing his chair back. It wasn't his fight. He had tried. He had given her the chance to accept help, and she had thrown it back in his face. If she wanted to drown in her own pride, that was her choice. He reached for his coat, ready to leave. But then, the sound of a sharp intake of breath, followed by an eerie stillness. Shaq turned just in time to see Victoria sway, her knees buckling. Her eyes fluttered, and for a split second she seemed to fight it, her body resisting the inevitable. But exhaustion had won. She collapsed. Shaq moved without thinking. Before she hit the cold, unforgiving tile, he caught her. One arm braced against her back, the other steadying her head before it could slam against the ground. A few customers gasped. A chair scraped loudly as someone stood up too quickly. The barista nearly dropped the cup she was holding, but Shaq didn't notice any of it. He knelt carefully, adjusting Victoria's limp form so that she was stable. Her breathing was shallow, her skin paler than before. She had pushed herself too far, and now she had nothing left. The baby, now completely alone, screamed even louder, little arms flailing in distress. Shaq turned his head toward the stroller, his own heartbeat steady but fast. The baby needed comfort, and nobody else was moving. Shaq reached out slowly, carefully lifting the baby from the stroller. The child was small, delicate, red-faced from exhaustion and fear. Shaq held him securely, instinctively supporting his tiny head. The crying didn't stop immediately, but something shifted. The baby's tiny fists clenched around the fabric of Shaq's sleeve, as if recognizing that the warmth was different now. The sobs turned into uneven gasps, then quiet whimpers. And then, miraculously, silence. The baby snuggled into Shaq's chest, breathing in slow, shaky gulps. The entire cafe watched in stunned disbelief. A woman near the counter whispered, "He just calmed him down." A man in a business suit muttered, "Huh, didn't expect that." Some customers exchanged glances, their assumptions cracking just a little. For the first time, they saw Shaq as something other than a stranger, other than an outsider. But not everyone. An older man near the window scoffed, shaking his head. "Doesn't mean anything," he muttered to no one in particular. "Anyone can hold a baby." Shaq heard him, but he didn't care, because this wasn't about proving anything. It was about doing the right thing. The cafe doors burst open as paramedics rushed in. A waitress had called 911 the moment Victoria collapsed, and now 2 EMTs moved toward her with practiced urgency. Shaq gently passed the baby to Riley, who, for the first time since he had known her, looked truly shaken. She cradled the child carefully, murmuring soft reassurances. One of the paramedics, a tall man with graying hair, glanced at Shaq. "You were the one who caught her?" Shaq nodded. "She just collapsed. She's been running on empty for too long." The paramedic nodded grimly. "It happens more often than you think." Victoria stirred slightly, a weak groan escaping her lips. The EMTs moved fast, checking her pulse, speaking to her in calm, professional voices. Shaq stepped back, giving them space. But when Victoria's eyes finally fluttered open, they locked onto him immediately. For a long, tense moment, she just stared. Her lips parted slightly, as if searching for words. But instead of gratitude, instead of relief, her face twisted in embarrassment. The tension returned, heavier this time. The cafe was still quiet, the weight of the scene keeping people glued to their seats. Shaq met Victoria's gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't need her to say thank you, but he could see it in her face. She hated that he had been the one to help her. One of the paramedics leaned down, speaking softly. "You passed out from exhaustion, ma'am. We need to take you in, just to be safe." Victoria barely acknowledged him. Her eyes remained locked on Shaq. Shaq tilted his head slightly, waiting. Would she say something? Would she let her pride crack, even for a second? Her lips pressed into a tight line. Then slowly, she turned away. Shaq exhaled through his nose. Of course. One of the paramedics stood and addressed the crowd. "All right, folks, give her some space." A murmur of conversation picked back up, but the energy in the room remained heavy. Shaq took a step back, slipping his hands into his pockets. He could feel the weight of every stare, the unspoken expectations. But he wasn't going to ask for gratitude. He never did. As the paramedics wheeled Victoria toward the ambulance, Shaq turned toward the exit. He had done what he could. That was enough. But then, a soft vibration, a phone buzzing. Shaq glanced to his left and caught the man in the suit lowering his phone, slipping it into his pocket. The same man who had been watching him earlier. The man didn't look up. He simply stood, adjusted his cuffs, and casually walked out of the cafe, as if he had just finished his job. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly. Something wasn't right, and he had a feeling this wasn't over. The steady beep-beep of hospital monitors filled the dimly lit room. The air smelled of antiseptic and something colder. Isolation. Exhaustion. Victoria lay propped up against the stiff hospital pillows, staring at the ceiling, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The fourth line in her arm dripped fluids into her system, replacing what her body had lost after days, maybe weeks, of neglecting herself. Her baby slept in a bassinet beside the bed, finally calm, unaware of the storm still raging around them. Across the room, Shaq leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching. He wasn't sure why he had stayed this long. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was unfinished business, or maybe it was because he recognized something in her. A woman who had no fight left, but refused to admit it. The silence stretched. Victoria hadn't said a word to him since she woke up. Not a thank you, not an acknowledgement, nothing. And Shaq, he wasn't expecting one. But just as he was about to turn and leave, the door swung open. A woman stepped inside, heels clicking against the tile, carrying an energy so sharp it cut through the air like a blade. She was in her late 50s, tall, elegantly dressed in an expensive beige coat and pearl earrings, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek chignon. Every inch of her screamed status, control, and quiet judgment. Her icy blue eyes flicked to Victoria, then to the baby, then, finally, to Shaq. And in that moment, Shaq knew exactly who she was. "Oh, for God's sake, Victoria." Her voice was clipped, sharp with impatience, like a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. She didn't move toward the bed, didn't ask if Victoria was okay, didn't check on the baby. Instead, she crossed her arms and sighed. "What kind of mess have you gotten yourself into now?" Victoria flinched, not visibly. No one else would have noticed. But Shaq saw the way her fingers clenched against the blanket, the way her breath hitched ever so slightly. This wasn't a concern. This was disappointing. Shaq had seen a lot of things in his life, but he had never seen a mother walk into a hospital room and make it feel colder. Victoria swallowed hard, sitting up straighter. She didn't meet her mother's eyes. "I'm fine," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to come." Her mother scoffed. "Of course I did. Your neighbors saw the ambulance. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Shaq's jaw tightened. "That's why she's here? Not because she's worried, but because of how it looks." Victoria exhaled slowly. I got tired." Her mother rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Everyone's tired, Victoria. That doesn't mean you collapse in the middle of a coffee shop like some charity case." Some charity case. Shaq saw it then, the moment Victoria's walls went back up. That armor, that stubbornness, that pride, she had learned it. It was survival. And suddenly everything made sense. Victoria hadn't been born with these prejudices. They had been drilled into her. Shaq could see it in the way she hesitated before speaking. The way she braced herself before her mother even said a word. The way she had snapped at him at the café. Not because she truly hated him, but because it was what she had been taught to do. She had been raised in a world where weakness was unacceptable, where people like Shaq didn't deserve her respect. And even now, even when the man she had been conditioned to hate had saved her, she couldn't bring herself to say the words. A nurse entered, checking Victoria's vitals. She glanced at the clipboard, then hesitated. "Your emergency contact didn't answer," she said carefully. "Would you like us to try again?" Victoria stiffened. Her eyes darted toward her mother, just for a second, but it was enough. Shaq caught it. Her mother scoffed. "Don't bother. He won't answer." Shaq's attention sharpened. "He?" Victoria looked away, pressing her lips together. The nurse shifted uncomfortably. "Well, if he does call back, we'll let you know." She left quickly, sensing the tension in the room. Shaq didn't say anything, but he saw the way Victoria's fingers gripped the hospital blanket. Too tight. And now he knew why. She wasn't just exhausted. She was alone. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He had seen this story before. Hell, he had lived it. He had once been a kid waiting for a father who never came home. He had once known what it felt like to be abandoned by the one person who was supposed to protect you. And for the first time since this entire mess started, he saw Victoria for what she truly was. Not just a woman who had snapped at him in a coffee shop, not just someone raised to look down on men like him, but a woman who had been left behind. A woman who had never been given the choice to be anything else. Shaq inhaled deeply. He should leave. This wasn't his business. It never was. And yet, his feet didn't move. Instead, he turned back to Victoria, really looking at her this time, and she looked back. For a long, heavy moment, neither of them spoke. But something in her eyes had changed. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't shame. It was uncertainty. For the first time, she wasn't sure if everything she had been taught was true. And for Shaq, that was enough. For now. The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that crept under your skin and settled in your bones. Shaq stood by his apartment window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up. He had grown to appreciate these quiet moments, the stillness before the world started demanding something from him. For a man who had once been the center of high-powered meetings, billion-dollar contracts, and media attention, he found peace in solitude now. No corporate boardrooms, no flashing cameras, just a cheap apartment with peeling paint and a coffee machine that groaned every time it was turned on. But this morning, wasn't quiet. His phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, assuming it was a spam call or another reminder from Lena about fixing the broken sink in the diner's storage room. But when it buzzed again, and again, and again, a sharp unease crawled into his gut. He grabbed the phone and glanced at the screen. 27 missed calls. His stomach tightened. Then, a text from Lena, the only person who ever texted him this early. Turn on the news. Now Shaq exhaled slowly, already knowing it wouldn't be good. He grabbed the remote, turned on the TV, and within seconds, his worst fears were confirmed. Racial incident at local café. Who is Shaquille Mercer really? Shaq's face filled the screen. The footage was grainy, shaky, captured on a bystander's phone. The clip had been expertly edited to frame him as the aggressor, a tall, imposing black man standing firm, while Victoria, a pale, distressed mother, clutched her crying baby. They had twisted everything. The newscaster's voice was smooth, professional, detached from the destruction being caused. Sources say that Shaquille Mercer, a former billionaire who mysteriously disappeared from the public eye years ago, was involved in an intense altercation with a distressed young mother. The incident has sparked a heated debate online, with some claiming Mercer overstepped boundaries while others say he was simply trying to help. Shaq set his coffee down carefully, his jaw tightening. He had sat in enough high-stakes rooms to recognize when something was deliberate. This wasn't just a news story. This was a hit. And then the screen cut to Victoria's mother. She sat on a pristine white couch in what looked like a high-end TV studio, her blonde hair neatly styled, her pearl earrings gleaming under the bright lights. She looked calm, collected, rehearsed. "My daughter was in distress," she said, her voice full of carefully crafted concern. And this man, this stranger, inserted himself into her situation. "I don't know his intentions, but I do know that my daughter and grandson deserve to feel safe." Safe. Shaq exhaled through his nose. She had chosen her words carefully. She wasn't accusing him of anything outright. She was letting the audience fill in the blanks themselves. The damage was done. Shaq didn't need to check social media to know what was happening, but curiosity got the better of him. He pulled up Twitter, and sure enough, his name was everywhere. Who is Shaquille Mercer? Protect mothers and children. Shaq did nothing wrong. His past, the life he had spent years trying to leave behind, was being dragged back into the spotlight. Some people defended him. "I was there. The guy was just trying to help. This is insane." So we're canceling people for being decent human beings now? Cool. Others? Not so much. Why was a grown man getting involved with a young mother and her baby? Feels weird. A billionaire disappears for years, then shows up working at a diner and getting into public fights? Yeah, nothing suspicious about that. Shaq closed the app, jaw tight. He had seen this cycle before. The world didn't care about the truth. It cared about the narrative. Somewhere across town, Victoria sat on her bed, phone clutched in her hands, staring at the same headlines. Her stomach churned. This was spiraling out of control. She had spent her whole life avoiding controversy, doing exactly what was expected of her. And now, her face was everywhere. The worst part? No one had even asked her what actually happened. Her mother had gone on TV without telling her. Journalists were flooding her inbox, asking if she wanted to share her side of the story. And the internet? It had already decided who she was. A privileged, spoiled white woman who had humiliated a black man in public. Or, depending on which side you were on, a helpless mother who had been intimidated by a dangerous stranger. Both versions felt wrong. And then, there was Shaq. For years, she had been taught to fear men like him, that they were dangerous, that they were untrustworthy, that they were never to be given the benefit of the doubt. And yet, when she had collapsed, when she had been at her most vulnerable, he had been the one to catch her. And now, the world was tearing him apart for it. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut. What the hell was she supposed to do? Across the city, in a dimly lit office, the man from the café, the one with the sharp suit and slicked back hair, watched the news with quiet satisfaction. Nathan Cross, investigative journalist. His phone buzzed. He answered without looking away from the screen. "It's done," he said simply. A voice on the other end responded, low and measured. "Good. Keep digging. There's more to Mercer than just a billionaire dropout." Nathan smirked. "Oh, I know. And by the time I'm done, everyone else will too." He hung up, tapping a pen against his desk. Shaquille Mercer had been a ghost for years. No interviews, no scandals, no public statements, nothing. People like that? They weren't clean. They were hiding something. And Nathan Cross was going to find out exactly what. Back in his apartment, Shaq let out a slow breath. He had two choices: disappear again, walk away, let the world eat itself alive over a false story. Or step into the fire and take control of it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Shaq stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Yeah." A pause. Then, Victoria's voice, software hesitant. "But there. I need to talk to you." Shaq's grip tightened around the phone. For the first time since this started. She sounded like she was ready to listen, and that meant the game had just changed. Victoria sat at the dining table in her mother's pristine white-on-white home, gripping the edge of her untouched coffee cup. The delicate porcelain felt foreign in her hands, like everything in this house. Her mother sat across from her, legs crossed, radiating the kind of controlled authority that only years of wielding power over others could create. "You need to stay quiet," her mother said, voice cool and unwavering. "This will pass if you just do as you're told." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Told by who? You?" Her mother sighed, setting down her own cup with precise elegance. "By people who understand how these things work. I've spoken to our lawyer. The media will move on as long as we don't feed into it." "We." Victoria swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. Her mother wasn't doing this for her. She wasn't protecting her or the baby. She was protecting their family name, their image. And Victoria had spent her entire life living inside that illusion. But this time was different. Because this time, she knew the truth. And the truth wasn't on her mother's side. Across the city, Shaq sat in the back of Lena's diner, phone on silent, watching the world rip him apart piece by piece. His name was everywhere. The media had already crafted their stories, twisting the narrative into whatever version of the truth best served their clicks. And Shaq? He said nothing. Did nothing. Lena paced in front of him, exasperated. "So that's it? You're just gonna let them do this to you?" Shaq took a sip of his coffee, unfazed. "Let them talk." Lena scoffed. "You're impossible." Shaq leaned back in his chair, watching her. She didn't get it. Most people didn't. The truth? It didn't need a stage. It didn't need interviews or press statements or carefully crafted responses. It just existed. People could believe what they wanted. It didn't change who he was. But Victoria? She wasn't built for this, and that meant she had a choice to make. The choice that changes everything. Victoria stared at the news anchor sitting across from her, microphone clipped to her dress, cameras positioned at every angle. Her hands trembled in her lap. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "You need to stay quiet. This will pass." But she couldn't. Not this time. The interview had started off safe. Softball questions, rehearsed answers. But then the anchor leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to let Victoria know she was stepping into dangerous territory. "You were there that day, Victoria. What happened at Perkins' Café?" Victoria inhaled slowly. This was it. Her mother's carefully constructed world was waiting for her to say the right thing, to play the victim. But instead, she told the truth. "I was wrong." Silence. The anchor blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Victoria straightened, her voice steadier than she expected. "I was wrong about Shaq Mercer. I was raised to see people like him a certain way, to believe things that aren't true, and I let that control how I treated him." The anchor leaned forward, sensing the weight of the moment. "So you're saying the story being told about him isn't accurate?" Victoria nodded. "It's not even close." She turned to the camera, her throat tight. "That man saved me, and my son." And just like that, everything changed. Nathan Cross, The man who had been digging into Shaq's past for weeks stared at his laptop screen, watching Victoria's confession unfold in real time. He should have felt victory. He should have been satisfied that he had gotten the scoop, had helped push the story into the national spotlight. But as he watched Victoria break down years of hate in a single sentence, something inside him shifted. Shaq Mercer wasn't the villain. And if that was true, then maybe Nathan had been on the wrong side of this all along. For the first time, he hesitated before typing his next headline. And then, he deleted it. Shaq sat in his apartment, watching the interview unfold. He should have been relieved. He should have felt vindicated. But instead, his phone buzzed. A name he recognized. A deal. One of the last business connections he had left was officially pulling out. The damage was done. People didn't care about the truth. They cared about perception. Shaq exhaled slowly, setting his phone down. He had lost. But somehow, it didn't feel like defeat. Because Victoria? She had finally won her own fight. And that was worth something. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of sizzling bacon, filling the air with the familiar comfort of Lena's diner. The morning rush had come and gone, leaving only the low hum of conversation from a few lingering customers. Shaq leaned against the counter, fingers wrapped around a mug of black coffee, steam curling toward his face. The world outside continued its relentless cycle, news reports flashing new scandals, social media moving on to its next outrage. People talked, argued, dissected what had happened to him, and then, just as quickly, they forgot. That's how it always worked. A few weeks ago, he had been the center of the storm. His face was everywhere. Headlines twisting the café incident into whatever narrative got the most clicks. People had picked sides, some defending him, some condemning him. The business deal he lost? Gone. The money he didn't really care about? Irrelevant. But Shaq? Still here. Still standing. Still unfazed. Lena, the diner's owner and his only real friend in this city, wiped down the counter beside him. Her sharp eyes flicked to him, studying him the way she always did. "You never did care what people thought, huh?" she mused, her tone a mix of admiration and frustration. Shaq smirked, taking another sip of his coffee. "Nah." Lena scoffed, shaking her head as she tossed the rag over her shoulder. "Must be nice." Shaq didn't respond right away. He had spent too many years caring, too many years trying to be the man people expected him to be. A man who played the game, who followed the rules, who proved himself over and over. Until he finally understood the truth. People saw what they wanted to see, and he wasn't here to prove anything. Across town, Victoria stood in front of a small, unassuming brick building, shifting the weight of the donation boxes in her arms. Haven Women's Shelter. She had walked past this place dozens of times, never once stopping, never once thinking about the people inside. The women who had nowhere else to go. The ones who had lost everything. She had spent most of her life pretending people like them didn't exist. But now? Now she was walking through those doors, not as someone looking down on them, but as someone who finally understood. A woman at the front desk, mid-50s with warm brown eyes and a face full of quiet strength, glanced up. "First-time volunteer?" she asked, offering a small but knowing smile. Victoria hesitated, then exhaled. Something like that. She set the boxes down, running her fingers over the folded flaps. Inside were things she never thought she'd part with: coats, baby clothes, shoes. Things she had once thought she needed to hold on to. But she didn't need them anymore. Victoria had spent weeks rethinking everything: her beliefs, her upbringing, the prejudices she had never questioned. She had lived her life in a world that told her what to think, how to act, who to trust, and she had let it control her. Not anymore. Her mother had cut ties with her after the interview. Her old social circles? Silent. But for the first time in her life, Victoria felt free. She wasn't looking for redemption. She was creating her own. Online, the conversation about her and Shaq had shifted. Some people refused to let go of their version of the story. "She's just doing this for damage control. Too late to act like a good person now." But others? They saw the difference. People can change. The fact that she admitted she was wrong says a lot. At least she's trying to fix her mistakes. That's more than most would do. Victoria had spent her whole life worrying about what people thought of her, what they said behind closed doors, what they whispered in charity galas and high society events. But now she didn't care about perception. She cared about the work. And slowly, people started to believe in her transformation. Not because of what she said, but because of what she did. The familiar chime of the bell above Perkins Cafe's door rang as Victoria stepped inside, adjusting the strap of her purse. She hadn't been back here since everything happened. And yet, the moment she walked in, it was different. No whispers, no stares. She wasn't the woman who had caused a scene anymore. She was just another customer. At the counter, Riley blinked in surprise. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Victoria hesitated, then smiled. "Didn't think I'd come back." Riley smirked, passing her a menu. "Coffee's still terrible, in case you were wondering." Victoria laughed, and for the first time, it wasn't forced. A movement near the corner of the cafe caught Victoria's eye. Shaq, sitting in his usual booth reading the paper, sipping his coffee, like none of this had ever happened. For a moment, she considered leaving. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't sure what to say. But then Shaq looked up. Their eyes met. And just like that, the weight of the past lifted. The tension, gone. The regret, gone. Victoria took a slow breath. Then, she walked toward his table. Shaq raised an eyebrow as she slid into the seat across from him. "Didn't think you'd sit," Victoria smirked. "Didn't think you'd let me." Shaq chuckled, setting his coffee down. Fair enough. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that didn't need words. And then, Victoria finally said the words that once seemed impossible for her. "Thank you." Shaq nodded. "Took you long enough?" Victoria laughed softly, shaking her head. And just like that, the past was behind them, and a new beginning had already started. Can people truly change? Shaq walked away from wealth and power, but the past refused to stay buried. Victoria was raised on prejudice until one moment forced her to see the world differently. This isn't just a story about redemption. It's about the choices that define us. What would you have done? Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and follow for more gripping, thought-provoking stories that challenge perceptions and push boundaries. Your next favorite story starts here.